Opportunity to speak with you. I know it's been a long day and many have been sitting for a very long period of time. So I'm going to encourage anyone who needs to stand up for a moment, give your legs a little bit of a shake. And if there's something else you need, like a drink of water or anything else, it's good to stretch, get the blood flowing a little bit more, and then when you're ready to have a seat. So for me, one of my needs after sitting all day is to stand up and stretch, to walk around. And this gets me really to what I'm here to talk to you about. And it's really building on what you've been hearing throughout the day. And it's really about understanding what are the needs. And I'm going to mostly focus on learner needs as I'm talking about a design approach to our curriculum. But as a faculty developer, I very much consider what my faculty needs are, because the faculty, the supervisors, the preceptors, they intersect with the learners. And together, they make up that educational experience for the learners. So it's really important to have an inclusive view of all of the users within your educational activities. So just in terms of disclosure, I do hold educational grants, none of which are related to what I'm talking about today. So I don't have any financial disclosure, conflicts of interest in what I'm going to be speaking about. I am at McMaster University, where my research and my education activities are based. So as you know, and if you've seen today, learning takes place in a variety of places. It can take place in a clinical teaching unit, in an intensive care unit, in an emergency room, in an ambulatory care clinic. And as we've seen through the pandemic, a lot of this happened virtually. It can occur in simulations. It can occur in clinical skills labs, in grand rounds, in journal clubs, in research settings. So our learning takes place in a variety of different spaces. And we're really good as educators and educator developers in designing curriculum based on outcomes and objectives. What is it we want our learners to be able to achieve at the end of the day? And that process from an instructional design perspective is called a backwards course design, where we start with the end in mind. So we know, where do we want to end up? How are we going to assess that our learners have actually got there? And then we design the learning activities and content that will enable our learners to develop those skills and that knowledge to be able to achieve those outcomes. But often what this process doesn't take into account is the experience of the learners going through those activities and learning that content. And that's where design thinking approaches come into play. So this slide illustrates really the intersection that happens when we start to take a design-centered approach. The humans are at the center of a design thinking approach. And so traditionally, as I said, we take more of that backwards course design, where if we look at the circles on the left side, we've got the curricula, the educational tools. From this perspective, we develop what is feasible. But then we marry it with the education mission. What are the outcomes? What are the competencies we want our learners to achieve? We're really good at that portion of it, but as I said, the missing piece is that third circle, which is the learner need. We could also substitute that with the faculty, the preceptor, the supervisor need. And really at the center where all of these intersect is the educational innovation. So earlier today, we saw videos that were shared as an internet resource for surgeons. And in some of those videos, you saw that there was an overlay of shapes above some of the organs, and that they were labeled. And so the design of that particular education video may have met a need for a learner who's a novice who may not know what they're looking at. We heard that there's the development of podcasts. For some learners, listening to something while they're moving rather than sitting still may better meet their need, may allow them to absorb that information. Often we design our curricula in a way we want to teach it. We're in a lecture setting. Often we put up PowerPoint slides or some type of slide or video, and we talk to whoever's in the audience. But there's other ways in which we can deliver content and have our learners engage with each other in that process. So really, when we're starting to think about using a design-based approach, we're really getting at not just the what we're doing, but the why we're doing it. And this is an example of a suture lab. So I remember when I learned how to suture and tie a basic knot. I am not a clinician. It was done for research purposes. And when I was being taught, really the outcome was, could I tie a knot that would stay in place? That's all I needed. It didn't have to be fancy. It didn't have to be complicated. I just needed to be able to close the skin together. Now, if you're a surgeon, just having that basic knot, its simple principle of holding the skin together, may not be enough. You may need to learn something more complex. And from a learner perspective, when they're sitting in that suture lab, it's important to understand why they think they need to be there learning how to suture. What is it that they are hoping to get out of that process? Is it just that they can learn how to tie a knot efficiently? Or is it potentially that they are looking at perhaps developing some more advanced skills, ones that may be noticed by other surgeons that they are going to train with, that they will be able to develop the skill with such competency that they will be trusted to be called right to the forefront and be able to take part in the surgery itself? Or they may be looking at learning special techniques that are a preference of a particular surgeon that they're working with. So understanding what the learner wants to get out of it may change how that learning activity is actually designed. So this brings us to another framework. I know you've seen a lot of frameworks today. You've seen competency-based medical education. I haven't shared with you the whole wealth of instructional design models. But what I'm sharing with you is a process that really works with everything that you have seen earlier today. Because what it is a process that allows you to really think what the needs are of your user. So design thinking, some of you may have heard of this before. It's been very common in the fields of engineering, in marketing. It's really understanding where the need is and how do we develop a solution that is going to best meet the real needs. And so there's a number of different frameworks within design thinking. This one is one that we've been using, which is a 5-step process by D. School from Stanford. And it has 5 core phases. The first is empathize, the second define, the third is ideate, the fourth prototype, and the last one is to test. And prototyping and testing are often occurring simultaneously. And while this looks like it's a linear path, it's in fact an iterative cycle, and often that we're going back and forth in the cycle till we're getting to the final prototype that's going to go forward. So in the empathize phase, we're really wanting to understand what is the real need. And so earlier today, we heard about that in the moment assessment, where the learners were putting in information and answering how they felt about a particular learning activity in the moment. And then it was shared that when they reflected later on, after maybe a month or so after the learning activity had finished, their reflection actually happened to be a lot different. And so if we rely simply on methods that are gathering data post-activity and not gathering what we really want to know about the learner, we may be missing out on key opportunities for how we design our curricula for our learners. The empathize phase really gets at what does someone think, how do they feel, what are they doing, and how are they acting. In the define phase, we start taking all of that information that we have gathered, and we might have gathered it through a number of methodologies, some of which might be interviews. We might be having what are called empathy maps created, where learners will just put down their thoughts on sticky notes and create a map of thinking, feeling, doing, and saying activities. We take all that information and we start to uncover what is the problems that are emerging. What are the pain points? And I like to think of pain points really as opportunities, because it's somewhere then we can intersect and intervene. Then we go into a stage where we start to ideate. We take what we felt was the most meaningful challenge or the most meaningful pain point and look at what could we do to make that better? What solutions could we develop? And so we do a lot of brainstorming in this process. We diverge our ideas and we come back and converge. And once we come back to what our core ideas are that we think might be feasible, might be acceptable, might be not always practical, but would have a good impact on the learner and their future outcomes, we can then take it forward to the prototype phase, where at this point then, we actually prototype, and in its early stages, it might be simply a storyboard that we're creating that we bounce off our learners and say, what do you think about this? Do you think this might work in your context? Do you think this might work to meet your need? And then we test it, and we go back and forth in that process until we have something that we want to put in place. And you're probably very familiar with pilot projects, and this is really where that prototyping goes. We pilot it, we get the feedback from that pilot project, and sometimes it will get scrapped, and we go back to another prototype, or sometimes we need to make alterations, and then we put it forward again for testing. So to put this into action for you and to see an example, this was taken from a group in internal medicine who was struggling with really the switch to virtual care during the pandemic. The residents were struggling and the preceptors were struggling. And so this group decided to take a design-based thinking approach to understand where were the pain points, what were the real struggles, and what could they put in place to make this better. So they started at the Empathize phase in the process, where they really wanted to understand, both from the preceptors and from the residents, what was going on. And the methodology they used is very similar to other research methods you might use in other settings. They were using qualitative methods such as interviews and focus groups, but their questions were really focused on having the residents and the precepting attendings reflect on their experiences. They really wanted to know their thoughts, their feelings, and their actions. And these were a couple quotes that were captured as part of that study, reflecting what some of those experiences and thoughts were. And from the resident, it felt like the whole purpose of the visits was different. We were doing more triaging. And from the precepting attending, I feel like I'm not doing enough to teach and support the residents. So there were clearly these feelings of disconnect from what they'd been doing before, and a feeling of lack of being able to support the learners as they were in this new environment. The groups came up with over 30 different issues that were coming up to the forefront for them, and they started putting and evaluating these different pain points into a grid, which in this one, it was an impact and effort grid. And what they used as their factors and filtering where they placed this on the grid were the educational value that might be related to that pain point or issue, if there might be a potential cost with trying to resolve that issue, the time perhaps that it was taking, and the resources that might be necessary. And when we use these impact and effort grids, there's no magic number that we put on the scale. It becomes more of a sense of what is our kind of gut feeling, and based on our best knowledge of the different factors, where would we put this? From the defined phase, some of the key pain points that came up really were that there was disjointed communication practices, the phone versus video. So while they were on a virtual care call with a patient, the resident or the preceptor might be calling each other in the background. So there were multiple modalities being used during this one virtual care visit. There was also a lack of structured goals and expectations. And so this led them to really take what is it we want to focus on going forward and frame it into what we call a how might we question. So you're taking that pain point or opportunity and rephrasing it into a how might we question, because then it's something that we can solve. In their case, they looked at how might we re-envision the virtual precepting experience to optimize the environment for learners and teachers. And so then they moved into the ideate phase. And this is where it was the brainstorm of different ideas. And I've put these different ideas in yellow because they actually use sticky notes. They did it virtually using a tool called Jamboard, which is one of the Google apps that allows you to add text to the slide canvas in a post-it note fashion. And so some of the ideas that came up in the ideate stage were a virtual preceptor tip sheet, a real-time virtual clinical bulletin board, a virtual team huddle, and a digital shared learning plan. And what they did in this case, once they had the big brainstorm of different things that they thought they could try, they then mapped it again to the impact and effort grid. And then they decided to go forward with one prototype, which they then storyboarded out. And in this case, what they decided to do was create a tip sheet for tele-preceptors. But this tip sheet encompassed some of the other innovative ideas that had come out of the ideate stage because they could be encompassed within this tip sheet. So some of the tips for tele-preceptors that came up were around starting the session. So one of the issues or pain points that the residents felt was there was this lack of connection with other team members. They didn't have a shared space anymore. And so in the virtual huddle part of the starting session, it was a space for everybody to come together and connect before they started their virtual care visits. Logistics were also taken care of, and real expectations were set so the residents knew what was going to happen and what to expect. There was also advantages of the virtual environment that were included, because now there was an opportunity that didn't necessarily exist in the same way before. With tools like Zoom, being able to share screens, the resident could pull up results, they could be able to draw on a whiteboard and share an idea or share resources through the chat. So there was an opportunity now to communicate with the patient in a way that they hadn't been able to do so before. And they were also able to teach virtual competencies. So how do you actually conduct an exam in a virtual environment, knowing that the patient is on the other side? Now, I had the experience with my own child having to do a virtual care visit with a physiotherapist. And so I can imagine, while it's not internal medicine, it's another field, the difficulties from a physiotherapy standpoint of having to instruct the parent of the child who also had to be in the room how to manipulate their child and do specific actions or treatments with them through the virtual care. But there were opportunities in which I could then be empowered as the parent working with my child afterwards because of that care visit. So there are potential barriers to the process. This design thinking approach can be very time-consuming, but it is really beneficial. And so some of the potential barriers that I would like you to consider or kind of keep in mind if you were to take this on is, the first one I mentioned is poor brainstorming etiquette. Now, I don't know how many of you have been in a brainstorming session before. Has anyone been in a brainstorming session before? And how many of you, either through your own mind or perhaps maybe the person next to you, cut off your brainstorming thoughts? So you might have been writing something down and thought to yourself, well, that's not a really good idea. And you stopped your flow of thinking. Or the person beside you might have caught in a glimpse of what you're writing and said, well, that's not relevant. Why did you put that down? So brainstorming can get interrupted very easily, either through ourselves or through others around us. And so it's really important just to let those thoughts flow. And there's lots of strategies to help with brainstorming etiquette. But for us, that was actually one of the barriers that came up the first time we tried this. And so we had to set some real ground rules and stick to those so we didn't stop that process. You can have insufficient data to identify user-focused problems or solutions. So I encourage you to think about, where do you get your data from? It might be through an in-the-moment assessment. It might be through some course evaluation. It might be from a resident speaking to you after a procedure, more informal discussions. And so you take all of that information together and to be able to use that to help you identify what the real problems are. For me, in some of my courses, we have emails that come to us, we have discussion forums, and so we pull that data from lots of different sources. Another challenge can be that you can be married to your ideas or beliefs or your opinions and not open to the process. Design thinking encourages you to think outside the box, to try something different, to go beyond what might be expected. And so I encourage you to leave what you believe to be true at the door and just open to the possibilities. It takes stakeholders' time commitment, and your stakeholders are not just you as the educator or you as the education developer, but it's also your learners and your faculty who are involved in that process. But the anticipated outcome, for me, far outweighs the challenges that might come up in this process. We get together diverse teams with different perspectives, and overall it strengthens the empathy and ideation stages. And we develop user-focused solutions that are both reliable and feasible and viable in our settings. And lastly, I want you to think about design skills, thinking skills, as a competency. So yes, we can use it to develop our own curricula and educational tools, but we can also teach our learners design thinking skills. And this can be done to increase awareness and empathy. For example, understanding the patient experience. So earlier today, we heard about shared decision making. Right there, as you start to elicit the needs of your patient, trying to understand what treatment option is going to best work with them in that discussion, that is part of the empathetic process. It also can impact healthcare innovation. This is where we start getting discovery of new devices and new interventions that really meet the needs of the end user. So I'm going to leave you with the thought of how might you use the principles of design thinking in your own work. And I've left some references attached as well that go into more detail with the examples that I was sharing today. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much. Design thinking is a wonderful tool as it appears. Would you use it again? Should you do it again?
We are using it again. Yeah. We continue to use it. So in one of my courses, we had developed a new platform for using our discussions, and it didn't take off so well because it was during the pandemic, and most of my learners were healthcare professionals who were being redeployed to other areas of the hospitals. They were under a lot of stress, as I'm sure many of you can relate. And so from an education activity, we didn't have the engagement that we had hoped. What we did, though, was take some of the early feedback that we had from that, and now we have made some changes, and we're re-prototyping again and putting it forward.
Would you change the process? Because there are many iterations of design thinking process. Would you change anything in the general process? Should you use it like for curriculum design again?
I wish that I could shorten the Empathize phase a little bit, because there was a lot of time doing data collection. I think the prototyping and the testing phase, I would like to shorten to a bit more of a rapid prototyping, that we could have probably trialed something before implementing it in a full course. So I don't know that I would necessarily change the entire process, but look at ways in which maybe we could be a bit more efficient in some of the stages, so the process maybe doesn't take so long.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.